Our next speaker will be Bill Rose. He's a retired geologist from Tech, and now he's into geotours, and not just the geology, but how people were affected by the geology of this area. And we went on a geotour with him this summer again, which was amazing. Last year we went and he explained about the basalt and the black rock. This year it was the sandstone. He does 4 of them. I think he'll do them every year. Very worthwhile. He does other tours here just around Houghton, close by. Those are all very worthwhile and very interesting talk. And he'll be ready in just a moment.
Let me get situated here. I want to sit down because, can everyone hear me? Okay. I want to sit down because I have a Achilles tendon, which if I stand for a long time, it gets sore and I might re-tear it. And so be patient with me. I usually maybe have more energy when I can stand up, but we'll try and survive through this. So this is what I call a geo story. And I'm sure that there's things that are wrong about it. And with this audience, it's a wonderful audience. I know a lot of you, some of you know more than I do about these topics. And so I'm sorry if I get it wrong. But I like to put a story together, and in geology, stories are really common. In fact, they pay us to do that. They pay us to read rocks and tell a story about the rocks. This picture is a picture of a rock which is called the C&H conglomerate. And there's a piece of it up in Eagle River. And there's another piece that we've just slabbed up. But unfortunately, it's not an easy rock to see, but it's the most important rock in this district because it really paid the freight. It's a conglomerate that's loaded with copper. And the geostory of this rock is really the kind of the topic that I want to do today, is how did copper get infused in rocks in the copper country? And this rock, the C&H conglomerate, is not what the Native Americans mind. They tend to concentrate on veins, which were pure copper. This is a rock that was only a few percent of copper, but it was consistent. And so once it was found, they could follow it. But how does a rock get like this? How do you have a sedimentary rock that somehow gets infused with copper, and copper that's not a sulfide, but a native copper? This was a puzzle to everybody, and it was against the conventional wisdom. In those days, in the 1840s, their geology was very young. It was not a well-developed science, and many people say it's still very young. We have so many things to think about in geology that we make a lot of uncontrolled theories, and that was certainly true. But this rock challenges all of that and still does. We still don't really understand a lot of the details about how something like this forms. This is some of the main work that I do now. I'm retired, but I'm really interested in how the local geology here in the Keweenaw affects people. And so this is a website in which I've developed this. And one of the main objectives of this website, all you have to do is remember Keweenaw geoheritage and you can find it. Geoheritage is how geology affects people. And it's maybe stronger in some places than in others. I would argue it's stronger here than almost anywhere else that you can find. And part of that has to do with the ancient copper. It started a long, long time ago And we've heard already words from Robin about the early metal mining. But it continued, and it still affects us every day. And many people, I think, in the copper country can't articulate this very well, but they feel the geoheritage. So let me give you a little bit of background here. Any place on Earth just has little windows into the past. The past is a long time. If this is a line of all of Earth history from the beginning to now, 4.5 billion years old, that yellow line is the age of most of the Keweenaw rocks, the black rocks and most of the red rocks, a tiny little segment of Earth history. Actually, all of the big fossils on Earth are to the right of that. So the early part of Earth history was pretty much devoid of fossils. And there's the glacial period. And between these, there's really not much rock record here on the Keweenaw. So we have this little window of different kinds of parts. And there's the eastern UP and the central UP and Earth's origin and so on. And so on, in our geologic story here, we tell about really 5 elements of the geology. The lavas and the great continental split that took place, the sediments, the red rocks, the thrust fault, massive glaciation, and then finally Lake Superior, which filled in a basin that formed very early. And you can follow these things, and what I've tried to do is to explain this. And I explain it both on the web and also from field sites. Because the main point of all this is to get people outside and to look at the rocks. And we have a great resource, especially along lake shores, where, like this place, which is on Raspberry Island in Isle Royal, you have a wave-washed shoreline where the rocks are really well exposed and easy to see. And these are some of the sites that I've identified, and you can follow them on here, and you can find details about any one of them and fashion together your own field trip. I've been doing this for 45 years with students, but I've never really organized the background and the information about it, and now we're doing that. And of course, the ancient copper, this is just something I found from the Milwaukee Museum, but this is something I don't know much about. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but it's this early copper that really makes the geoheritage in this area so important and so dominant, and more so than happens in many other places. I'm interested in the confluence between oral histories, that is, Native American stories of the retreat of the glaciers, and our concepts of glacial geology. And so, we're learning to understand more and more about the events of the deglaciation, that is, the times since the ice retreated. And these are 2 gentlemen from Duluth who are really leaders in this. If you haven't seen this book, Talking Rocks, I really recommend it to you, because it's the result of a graduate class that was given in Duluth by the 2 of them. Carl Galboy is an artist and a Ojibwe elder, and he knows the Ojibwe stories. And Ron Morton is a geologist at UMD. And so they gave alternate lectures about the oral histories of the Native Americans, and then the geologic concepts, what we know about geology. And this is a problem in science, is we stay in our disciplinary holes, and as geologists we go outside and look at the deposits and the rocks, but we don't talk to people who have old stories about what happened. And in fact, the records of many of the deposits, especially in the post-glacial region, are in Native American oral histories. And that's what these presentations revealed. These people came here and gave a series of lectures, which was very rewarding. But anyway, follow this up if you're interested in wrong button. So what I want to do is show you, this is a little animation of the retreat. Whoops. Didn't do what I wanted it to do. Of the retreat of the ice. And so if you can watch the age, which is shown here, and then you can watch the pattern of the ice. And what I want you to see is, the shoreline and there's an ice-free corridor that develops, and that happens approximately 12,000 years ago. And so at that time, the Native Americans wandered maybe through that ice-free corridor or maybe along the shore. If they went along the shore, they might have been able to do it a little bit earlier. And so this is an interesting constraint on this, and that's what we think about in terms of the oral histories. After that, of course, there were big lakes and drainages. But this shows some of the extent of the ice during this glacial retreat. And there's a map of the ice-free corridors. And here's something I found about where artifacts are shown and the pattern of glacial ice distribution. So very early in this, there was artifacts found all over. I think these are mostly arrowheads and not copper materials. But the important part of this story from a geologic point of view is that when the ice pulled off, this is a drawing that shows a cartoon with some moraines here. So the glacier used to cover this entire area, and when it pulled off, it made a barren sort of region over the surface of the earth. And that's an advantage to geologists or to Native Americans because, because this is a bit of an ice field in Iceland. And so I just wanted to, this I got off of Google Earth. You can make movies of Google Earth. And so if you go to the termination of the glacier, we're going along this, and this is the zone where the glacier is melting faster than it's flowing forward. And this is the area in front of the glacier where there's a barren ground, no trees, moraines, kettle lakes, eskers, various kinds of features. And this is the way the copper country was when the ice first pulled off. It was barren and exposed, and many of the features of the subsurface geology were displayed in a way that is much better than it is now. And this was advantageous to the early people that came because we know they found the copper soon. This is just an example of this. This is a place called Horizon Road, which is up in Copper Harbor area. And last year, there was a big storm which abraded the shoreline. And where this abrasion occurred, it exposed many features that by abrasion, like these veins of calcite, beautifully displayed in detail. And so this is the kind of thing that you would have had in the history Here's this place called the Green Rock, where there's a chrysocolla vein that comes out. This is the Copper Harbor Lighthouse. And another example of a place where this happens below the surface of the lake. There's still preservation of magnificent geologic features. And so in our geotours, we look at a number of these kinds of features. This is just an example of some of the sites that we've identified in Calumet. So tomorrow with the Isle Royale Natural History Association, we're taking a little trolley tour of many of these kinds of places. Copper vein looks like inside lava. And this is an example of the kind of thing that Native Americans can find. This is a rather small one, just about 4 inches across. And this is on Washington Island in Isle Royale. These are hard to find now because they've been dug out. When people found them, they chipped them away. But underneath the lake, here's a Bob Barron who found this thick segment of a dike, which was part of a dike that stuck up out of the water in Great Sand Bay. And this is the one that's now at the Mineral Museum in a shelter. But it came, here are the veins. This is Great Sand Bay. That's where the boulder came from. Here are the veins of the mines at Copper Falls and Pethwick, and project them out into the bay, and you can see where they go. Well, they stick up out of the bottom of the lake. And this piece that Bob found was a piece of that vein which was loose and possible to harvest, but there's many more under the water. So now let's do a little bit of geologic background. 1.1 billion years ago, there was a great continent called Rodinia, and it was all put together like this, but it split apart. And there was a rift governed by a hot spot, which was centered roughly where Lake Superior is now. And you can see the crack. We can trace it with gravity as it goes underneath North America. Without this event, there would be no story about copper or anything else. It's part of the first event that happened, but it also created the basin where Lake Superior is located. So you'll hear people say, well, it's a glacial basin. Well, it is in part, but the real origin of the basin started with the hot spot. And here's a sort of a cross-section, Keweenaw Peninsula with black rocks, those are the lavas, red rocks, which are mainly sedimentary rocks. And so we have a basin that goes in an Isle Royale, it dips to the south, on Keweenaw Peninsula, it dips to the north. And here's the more or less the hotspot origin of that feature. As part of the continental environment, a rift developed. This is kind of a sequence of things that shows the development of the rift with time. A basin formed, and it sank and filled with sediments, a great hole. That's the Lake Superior Basin. And finally then, faults formed when there was compression from the side. That's those red areas. Probably a continental collision hundreds of miles away that pushed this together and made the basin rise. And that's important because it brought the copper closer to the surface. So here's our present surface. We had magma oceans, huge amounts of lava. One of the biggest outpourings of lava from Earth anywhere in Earth history. We know dates of this. Some of the big flows in the sequence have been dated by zircons, which are found inside the the lava flows. And so we have a good idea of how old these kinds are. There are 400 lava flows roughly that accumulated very quickly during this time period. And then there's a few later lavas like the ones at Eagle Harbor. I'm going to skip that. It's a very complex slide of the structure of this. But anyway, the rift, the big crack that formed, follows Lake Superior, and the basin of the lake formed really during this very early period. But the other really important thing about it is the heat that took place. So there's the axis, Isle Royale and Keweenaw West, and that's the way the rocks dip toward each other. This is the gravity anomaly caused by the rift. So we know it goes down to Kansas, even though it's buried below the surface. So we're the only place that has it well exposed. And it's really well exposed in many places. This is some of the Isle Royale occurrences with the very large lava flow, the greenstone flow, which goes through the northern part of Blake Point. But right in Houghton, you can see the effects of the lavas. This is a lava flow top, which is right behind, well, it's on Montezuma Avenue. And so there's a contact here between a flow top, which is kind of green and a little bit of pink, and the lava flow bottom, which is black. These are what we call hydrothermally altered. They're full of amygdaloidal minerals. The lava material was altered by hydrothermal solutions from underneath. And this is an alteration that affects the whole district, and it's very important for the formation of native copper. This is a picture from Yellowstone. So I want you to think about Yellowstone as a modern analog of this, because Yellowstone has a magma body at depth, and above it, it has a very strong hydrothermal system that's altering the environment. And that's what we had as part of our geo story here to account for the mineralization of the copper. And so the result of this is that we have rocks like this, what we call amygdaloidal minerals, all these different kinds of colors of things. And they all come from hot water solutions, usually between about 100 and 300 degrees C. Pretty hot, very analogous to what we see in the Yellowstone hydrothermal system. And the copper was part of this group of minerals, part of a regional hydrothermal alteration that took place. And there are many, many minerals, epidote and many others. But one thing I want to point out is that the evolution of copper deposits eventually focused on units like the C&H conglomerate. So here's a map of Calumet. This is the red jacket part, and this is Laurium over here, and this is the main road that goes through, and this arrow that you see here is the surface contact of this rock called the C&H conglomerate. And this shaded area that you see here is the mined out area of that deposit, which goes from the surface down to, I think, about 8,000 feet below the surface, sloping at 38 degrees. And so an amazing, but it was really the consistency of that unit up to 25 feet thick and 3 to 7% copper in a lot of places. That sustained mining in Calumet. The other kinds of occurrences are amygdaloids. So here's again, the C&H conglomerate. Here's the stratigraphic sequence. Each of these lines is a lava flow contact, so you're going through. This is what's called the number 13 conglomerates. Conglomerates were porous regions where those hydrothermal systems could pass water and deposit minerals. And so for some reason, this particular layer was extremely rich and consistent, and it's a remarkable occurrence. If you want to see this rock now, one place you can see it is in Eagle River, where there's been a restoration of the Douglas Houghton Monument. And so it's a beautifully preserved, but we've found some more of it, and we're in the process of slabbing it and making it more generally available. These are some things from the Seaman Mineral Museum, and you can see the detail of the copper surrounding boulders. These are what are called skulls, where boulders were surrounded by copper-bearing solutions moving in one direction, so that on the side facing the flow, they have more copper than they do on the other side. And this is a detail of one of the slabs that we just cut. So you can see what an amazing rock this is. And so one's going to be in the library of the Calumet School, one's going to be at the Mineral Museum, one's going to be at the Coliseum in Calumet. So you can put your hands on it. It's about a 6-foot diameter boulder, which was found up in Calumet and then slabbed by Ken Flood. In Calumet, the C&H conglomerate goes right through the town, right behind the schoolhouse. Here's one of the openings, which happens right on the school yard. That's the Calumet number 3 shaft location. And of course, the C&H conglomerate went right through the industrial corridor of the town and all the way down toward Millionaire Avenue. We found an occurrence of the C&H conglomerate which was underneath a mine dump. And so we're hoping to expose that and show it so that people can visit the actual outcrop location of that. A little bit about the Keweenaw Fault. It bisects the peninsula, and the important thing to know about it is that, whoops, something didn't work, is that this side of the fault, the north side, arose by about 3 to 5 miles. And that's where all the copper is located. It's not in the flat-lying Jacobsville part of the peninsula. It's all in this part. And so this movement of the fault was important, first of all, to provide channels for the movement of the geothermal fluids, and second, to move the rocks closer to the surface where we could find them. If it hadn't been for the fault, we probably nobody would have found copper. And the occurrence of fractures and subsidiary faults to the Keweenaw Fault, like the Hancock Fault, are really important in terms of locating where the mineral deposits are richest and most advantageous. So here's a few of the prominent. The Keweenaw Fault is not a simple line. It has many offshoots. So native copper is a mystery, because most copper that we find in various places is in sulfide form. And so that's one of the puzzles of this that we really don't understand. There may be some intrusions large intrusions of mafic lava that drove these hydrothermal systems. This would be the hot material underneath the hydrothermal system. There's some evidence for those in drilling that's taken place underneath the sandstone. And that's an interesting part of this. There also are some dikes, like the one that produced the Eagle. You can go and see this boulder. It's now on display in the Dow building. But this is a sulfide boulder from the Eagle mine. But it's very similar in age to the rest of the Keweenaw lavas. But it contains, obviously, lots of sulfur. It's associated with very high temperature dikes, maybe those dikes associated with the first splitting of the continent of Rodinia, and where sulfide copper was abundant. There's also nickel and some rare earth elements associated with this. A very interesting rock and part of the story. Did the sulfur in this system get purged early because of these phenomena, and people are looking for more of these kinds of things. So these are some cartoons. You can explore, I know I'm throwing a lot of stuff at you, but you can explore more about any of these things on my website if you're interested in. What do these occurrences like the Echo Lake, Gabbro, the Yellow Dog, peridotite have to do with the Keweenaw Rift and the ultimate formation of native copper? I'm going to skip this. Here's the Keweenaw Fault with the rising of material up close to the surface. Lavas and the red beds. And the Jacobsville sandstone. And the national parks and our development and our study here. Why should we care about the Keweenaw Fault? Well, it influences our landscape, but conduit for copper solutions and the raising of the deposits close to the surface. We have an advantage here in the copper country because there's been a lot of fundamental geologic work done. And so I've got some information about some of the people that are involved in this, but they left behind great documentation, maps and various kinds of things, and so we have a lot of background geologic information which I think is valuable for you as archaeologists. This is my granddaughter, and I try to take her outside. Right now she's upset about the marshmallow, but it's interesting how people react to geology, and I don't expect everybody to care about this, but if you study geology, you really worry about why you have so much native copper here. It's a kind of a cosmic oddity. So why is the copper native? What was the heat source in this system? Was there a magma body below the surface? And of course, the whole question of why you get hot spots in certain. There's many things we don't know. That's always the kind of case. We're interested in preservation. Tomorrow there's another dedication for land, geologic land around Lake Superior that's being preserved. And so we want to preserve these places and so that people can look at the geologic history. Here's early copper discoveries, the Ontonagon boulder. Here is an aerial view of Houghton Douglas Falls, okay, which is a parcel of land where the Keweenaw Fault goes right across this, and it's now been reacquired for public access. And so in the next couple of years, we're going to develop a plan for trails and access to the Houghton Douglas Falls. Michigan Copper was the first great metal mining district. So even after the native development of thousands of years, it is very important from industrial history point of view. And so here's again one piece of one of the veins that was given by Mr. Lizadro. And I think I've already talked about this as maybe is a good place to stop and just let you ask some questions if you want. I'm not sure how much I violated your time relationships, but anyway, thank you for your patience.
Dr. Rose, can I go look at your 5 chapters of the story slide again?
Yes, you can. Wants me to log in. That what you meant?
Yep.
Yeah, this is just an intellectual division that I made for the point of the website. And so if you go, I've added 3 elements in here just to sort of put things into context. These are the parts that aren't exposed in the Keweenaw, but I give a lot of information about the great lava flows, the large lava flows of the rift, and then I talk about the red bed sediments, the conglomerates, and the sandstones that filled the whole of the rift. And then I have a section on the Great Thrust Fault, and then section on glaciation, and then about the lake. And these are the same subjects in which we do geotours. So we've been doing geotours. We use the Agassiz, the small boat from Michigan Tech, to go out and look at lakeshore sort of exposures. And usually we have one of these themes that we're trying to follow, just so it doesn't become too wild and confusing. I mean, it's still wild and confusing, but. Yes?
I found your melting of the glacier sequence very interesting, and I suspect you have a vastly different idea of climate change than some of our politicians in Washington. I just wonder what you might say about it.
I'm not an expert on climate dynamics, but I have a bias, and the bias comes from my interaction with other people. There's a very excellent group of people here at Michigan Tech in a variety of departments who are working on climate change. And so I talk to them, and I have graduate students who go between our department and their expertise and work on climate change. And I also travel a lot, and I've just been to Alaska, for example. And so I have an impression of glaciation from that point of view. And so not being an expert, it's very impressive the rate now of temperature rise that is happening on a global sort of basis. There are exceptions. There's some places where the temperature is not rising, but and there's a great deal of interest in that concept. There's also a great deal of discussion and skepticism, and I don't think that anybody disputes the temperature rise that has taken place. There's more controversy about the cause, but even for the cause, it's hard for people not to accept that fossil fuel burning is important as far as the cause is concerned. And again, I just say that that latter part of the thing, that really just comes mainly from the context I'm in. The academic environment is strongly in favor of positive consideration of that hypothesis. Does it mean that it's a black and white issue? Absolutely not. You know, Alan, as well as anyone, that things in science are not black and white.
No. But I also know that when I first came up here in early 1960s, that we had no crows around here in the winter. Now we do. I also know, being a trapper,
Turkeys, too. There's
that
many, many
we
more
didn't
turkeys.
see many raccoons in this part of the Burr Peninsula. Now we have tons of them, and other similar changes. So
Well,
that's interesting.
I've asked people about that very issue because I'm very interested in that too. Many wildlife changes. And what they tell me is that it has to do with reforestation, that the forest has grown back a lot, and it's the existence of the forest that really enhances things like wildlife habitats and corridors. But that's, you know, that's also an effect of man. You know, we're not cutting down trees as much as we did in the past, for whatever reason.
Just so it'll be a while before the Zika